Thank you so much for joining our panel. I'm going to share my screen. So I want to start my talk by showing a map of field trip trials. So here we can see most part of China. And for the Republic of China, briefly, it's a modern nation state, which ended the imperial dynasty of Qing in 1912. So this whole journey we will be focusing on today was conducted in the early summer of 1923. So it's 100 years from today by a group of third year college students who majored in the Bowu studies. And just put this briefly, the Bowu studies in the 1920s in China can be seen as very similar to natural histories in the European context. But of course, there will be local adaptations. So these young college naturalists spent more than a month on the road to complete their trip. Their plan was to take direct observation to study and examine the most distinctive geological formations in different parts of China. So their trip started here, today's capital city of China, Beijing. It went down across north and central China towards the hinterland, then turns to the southern eastern China at the city of Daye. I hope you can see the blue dots there that's showing their stops, which locates over the southern bank of the Yangtze River. And this was their first stop to observe the distribution of iron ore. While reaching Nanjing and then Hangzhou, they observed rocks and the mineral formations in local mountain areas. Then they returned by taking a different trial on the relatively east part of China through Shandong province. And their fourth stop was at Boshan. Then they getting back to Beijing. So when looking closely at published materials related to this trip, I wondered, and perhaps you are right now, just like me, how could this form of practice help improve our understanding of the making of natural knowledge and natural history? And in what sense the integration of Bowu studies or natural histories into the school education reflected critical transitions in the history of science in modern China. So in other words, how could we better understand history of modern sciences by looking at practices of these field trips? And in which ways this kind of knowledge could contribute to more general themes concerning global history of science and history of science and society. So with these questions in mind, my research leads to some more small hand-drawn maps, field notes, trip reports, and photos taken en route. So in fact, there were numerous smaller and similar field trips took place during the first 2 to 3 decades. And these trips distributed across different parts of Republican China. And mostly they were conducted by college students majoring in Bowu studies. But at the moment, I have not yet put together a clear pattern of their destinations. It seems to me still largely contingent choices owing to available funds and how much time they had and their different study requirements. But also there seem to be some kind of basic guidelines. These trips often went to natural sites with distinctive characters and were located within their own province or adjoining provinces, so not very far away. Sometimes they went to mountain areas, which were those were very with cultural and also natural significances. Some in the north part of China, they went to observe seaweed, for example, and some in the southern China, they went to visit cities of Putuo and Wuxi. Some of them simply observed their gardens at school and nearby lake areas. So the trip we just looked at was quite exceptional since it visited 4 different places and covered several provinces to carry out quite a large group observations. With these source materials, I want to suggest that a new kind of scientific practice was quickly progressing in early Republican China, and its significance has not yet been fully examined nor substantially understood. So historians have shown that the spatial and the geographical factors play positive and structural roles in our understanding of sciences in the past. And for historians studying the scientific life in particular, the spatial dimension affords crucial insights into the environmental measures of knowledge making. So this ranging from the natural philosophers' solitary sanctuary to the center of busy cities, and from the restricted laboratories to nature's frontiers. So with close links to social studies of scientific practice, foundational scholarship has focused on both the built environments, such as rooms of curiosity, workshops, and the marketplaces, the pub, factories, hospitals, all kinds of museums and zoos, and the laboratory. So as well as the outdoor research areas in the field, such as biological conservatories, national parks, botanical gardens, and field stations. So field trips, seen as a relatively unique kind of educational and scientific activities, also offers us quite an interesting perspective on the intersections of the history of natural history and the history of science and society. Historian David Allen has examined the rise of the botanical field class starting from the 17th century and more widely practiced in the 19th century, especially for medical educations. So this was both studied in Europe and the UK, especially London and Edinburgh. In Allen's work, we can see that medical students were guided by teachers to go into the countryside and to recognize herbs in the living state. So they sometimes went to neighboring mountains or more conveniently developed their own physic garden. In Cambridge and Oxford, however, the value of field teaching remained underdeveloped. And this situation was largely a result of the views of major teachers. Another historian, Sally Gregory Kolstad, also has shown that around the late 19th century, North American public schools engaged in systematic introduction of nature study. And the main backdrop to this story was scientists from universities of Chicago and Cornell, who had played a key role in these initiatives. And this kind of nature study movement went in parallel with the new education reform movement and the school gardening movement. So for the recently established state of Republican China, the early 20th century actually saw unprecedented and pivotal changes in both social structure and national education systems. in many ways, when I start to think about typical narratives of introduction and promotion of modern sciences at this time, the emergence of field trips in in Chinese schools offers us a story with a very different focus, and it was told by different historical actors. Here we have a field report written by third-year college student Yu Mo of the Peking Teachers College. His report gives us a lot more information of what they actually observed. In addition, the social and local context suggests that such field trips were very desirable and would actually help students to learn nature better. So here he said, the practice of Bowu or natural history on small scale, it takes just one room to set out exhibitions. On larger scale, it encompasses everything found in the whole universe. The studies of botany and zoology, even with just one bit of skin or one piece of leaf, can be taken in our study as sufficient research materials. Yet this certainly cannot be fully investigated by merely classroom discussion. Neither can we truly understand by simply using specimens or models. Thus, the empirical observation in any way must not be neglected. Considering the national budget on education is overdue several months and our college spending cannot cover everything, our own professors thus took on this responsibility and personally financed our trip. Their generous allowance enabled us to embark on our trips. We also find a short introduction showing how to get prepared before taking field trips. This one was written relatively earlier in 1907 for more general interested audiences in China. Recent educators all promote the intuitive education. Therefore, primary schools arrange excursions, middle school plan for travel. As all scholars would agree, the intuitive education should take on opportunities afforded by such trips to carry out investigation for the Bowu studies. Indeed, the method of field investigation has so much to do with board learnings. And he continues to suggest there were so many different approaches and methods of conducting field practices. He emphasized how this way of interaction with nature actually was both entertaining and useful for general education. Another interesting example here suggests that being on the move was central to the practice of field trips. The author named LYM said, once we're taking the bus to travel a long way, feeling its speed just like the wind and lightning, then we can see the great cliffs of the mountain go up and down, colors of the greens rolling and waving, thick forests run backward. The flat lines merged and faded. All changes of possible kinds take place immediately, and our eyes cannot catch anything in detail. Let's take a field trip as an exemplary experiment to observe the different lines across various places. Thus, the varieties and species of plants are naturally different. This is due to the varieties and this is due to the climate and the local weathers, which transform natural things accordingly. The reason for plant distribution is based on this observation. The final example I would like to show here is a field trip carried out in 1920 by first-year college student studying Bowu at Shenyang Higher College of Teachers. This field trip was slightly different because they visited Japanese museums in Lushun. So Lushun was formerly a Chinese port city, but had been occupied by Japan after the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. So after he introduced various local exhibitions, factories, workshops, and laboratories, the author Liu Rongfu commented, "After we parted a Japanese scholar, Mr. Song Yue, I climbed up to the top of Mount Baiyu to take an open view overlooking the present conditions in Lushun. Among the peninsula of the Tiger's Tail, the Mount of Gold harbors confront each other around the Mount Baiyu. The landscape and terrain is naturally critical in geopolitics, yet it was given to foreigners. How sad this is." To summarize, here I suggest we find important features distinguishing the field trips from other seemingly alike practices. For college students embarking on their trips, the main purposes were to gain knowledge of nature by immediate engagement with and to observe the natural space. It was not quite similar as a graduation trip or touring for sightseeing. We also have scholars working on international expeditions in different parts of China, but for field trips, students did not go to places outside China, and they were mainly exploring nearby areas. For their teachers, these trips were part of formal education, usually structured in the later years of college education, and were organized by students majoring in Bowu students. So practitioners themselves were not established scientists or doctors, and thus how the trips were conducted would be different from professional research. Here, I also want to note that for the history of scientific education in China, especially the early decades of the 20th century, most schools lacked the funds to purchase laboratory facilities. They only had minimal to basic teaching materials, little demonstrative models or learning tools. So the studies of Bowu became one common alternative in local scientific curriculums. And it was certainly more welcomed by students when their teaching faculty took them out into the field for direct observation than explaining botanical Latin names without a proper visual representation of plants being discussed. For Bowu studies of this period, several schools had their own teaching plans and departmental arrangements. It was a field of learning that encompasses botany, zoology, mineralogy, and sometimes human physiology, quite often also included geology. Given this context, the expectation of such field trips would be less specialized, and there were multiple ways for students to engage with the nature and learn from their trips. As a further reflection, I also want to say that we tend to take for granted the natural land as ideal sites for scientific voyages, fieldwork, and educational explorations. This talk aims to show that the historical complexity of such views by examining Chinese young students' field trips. I suggest that it was through the field trip, a new kind of educational engagement with nature, that a new spatial understanding of nature appeared in modern China, which dated no earlier than the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.